Hello. Just getting everything started here for our live August 2016 U.S. History Review. Okay, and we are on. We are live. We're going to start reviewing in about 2 minutes, but we'll do some pre-reviewing now. We'll go over kind of how the exam looks and kind of an intro of what we're doing. So if you're watching this today, you are probably getting ready to take the New York State U.S. History Regions, which will take place tomorrow morning. What we're going to do, we're about half an hour worth of review where we will kind of just go over some real basic things that may or may not be on the exam. I have no power. I have no knowledge of anything that is going on from the state's point of view. I am just a random history teacher in upstate New York and like to share my knowledge that I have with those of you who want my knowledge. When we are looking at the American history regions, many of you probably have already taken the global regions. You may not have. The American history regions is the identical formula and set up as the global regions, where it is 50 multiple choice questions, 1 thematic essay, 1 DBQ essay, and usually around 10 to 14 short answer questions that will go along and correspond with the DBQ essay that you will need to write. So that's the format of the exam. The exam is 3 hours long time, but you got a lot to do. You got a lot of writing, you got a lot of reading to do. So it will feel very quick. The way I'm planning on conducting tonight's review is actually working backwards. Normally we start from the beginning of American history and work backwards, but I've done a couple of those reviews before. And they're great. They're very useful. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to work more towards a modern time and moving back into history. We're only going to be doing this for about a half an hour today. So it's going to be relatively quick. I'm also going to do some theme stuff, which is very helpful because it's a better chance of your thematic essay being a themed-based essay. There's a phone. That's fun. And we're going to let it ring. Okay, so what we want to talk about, what we're going to start with is the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, we tend to think of that in the 1960s, where when we're thinking of civil rights movement, we're thinking mostly about freedoms and rights for African Americans. And in this, we can think of some key leaders. Martin Luther King is a great leader of the civil rights movement. He also Malcolm X is a member of the civil rights leader movement. Some other key people, maybe, I don't want to say they're smaller, but sorry, lots of noise going on in my house. We can also look at the NWACP, the National Advancement of Colored People, which is a organization that the whole point of the organization was to get civil rights for African American people. And the reason for these civil rights was particularly in the South. They had something called Jim Crow laws, which forced segregation. So this was the famous pictures of, white-only water fountains or businesses that were for colored people. And that's the foundation of why there needs to be this civil rights movement, is to increase what is the moving forward for the African American community. They are supported by Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was the president of the United States at the time. He made a Civil Rights Act, which actually increased and required desegregation in schools, on buses, on train car, everything had to be desegregated. And this is huge. So one of the key things that you want to look at that's really big is the idea of Topeka versus the Board of Education. So in the Topeka versus Board of Education Supreme Court case, it was about desegregating schools in the South. There was a young girl who was supposed to go to a school for African American students it was quite a bit further. It was a crappy school. It wasn't successful. It wasn't in a good area, where there was a school that was better for her. It was closer, it was cleaner, it was nicer, but it was for white kids. And she was denied to go to the school. And she said, wait a minute, but the rule is that we're allowed, up until this point, there was a law saying that you can have a separate but equal facility. So you could have a white school and a black school, but they had to be they could be separate, but they would also have to be equal. So they'd have to, both be, pristine and clean, or they could both be crappy, I guess, but whatever it was, they'd have to be the same. And this girl saying but that's not what's happening. My school's awful and the white school is great. And so they said, okay, well then segregation is inherently not equal. Segregation is not equal. So we can't have this. And Lyndon Baines Johnson helps come up with this Civil Rights Act that says, you're right, there is no separate but equal. Separate is inevitably not equal. We can't have that. It doesn't exist. One of the other things that we need to know about this is it was an era of civil disobedience. Martin Luther King is famous for civil disobedience. The idea is that he's going to have a non-violent movement. Martin Luther King is not going around, punching people in the face. He's saying, let's stand together, let's be strong, both whites and blacks, rich and poor. We're all going to unite. We're all going to support each other. And he's saying that's how we're going to be successful. And so that's civil disobedience. We've seen this in other times with like a hunger strike, strikes in general. That's all civil disobedience. Sit-ins at luncheons. So if there's a counter that white people are only allowed to eat in, then the African Americans would sit at the same counter and they would refuse to leave, even though they wouldn't be served until forever, ultimately. So that is civil rights. They also come through with the Voting Rights Act of 1954, and this is to remove anything that would hinder someone's constitutional right to vote. So we are all, via the Constitution, all of us over the age of 18 have our constitutional right to vote. But what was being done was that a lot of people were being told, no, you can't vote because your grandfather couldn't vote, so you can't vote, or you can't read, and it has a literacy clause, so if you can't read, then you can't vote. Literacy exam, so if you can't write, you can't vote. There was there was a poll tax. If you can't pay this tax, then you can't vote. This was all a way to get African Americans not to be able to vote in the elections. So they came up with the Voting Rights Act, which it made all that illegal, which we can certainly get into, that there's still some issues with that today. So that's a quick thing here on the Civil Rights Act. Let me see what else I want to talk about. We can talk about JFK. Again, we're going backwards tonight. We can talk about JFK. He establishes the Peace Corps, which is a not-for-profit, non-religious-based organization that's going to go around not only the United States, but around the world, and we're going to do great deeds, particularly in developing nations. We also, through the era of JFK, have the Bay of Pigs invasion, which is where we believe Cuba, which was a communist country at the time, we believe that they had weapons pointed to us in Florida. They're only 60 or 90 miles apart. And we said, oh, that's dangerous. We can't have that. So he then tries a failed attack on Cuba that goes very poorly, and an attempt to take a coup over Castro, the communist dictator. We also have the New Frontier, which is JFK's ultimate plan for America. And that's the fact that we're going to land on the moon. We're going to put a man on the moon and do all this great stuff. JFK does not see that through. He does die previous to man landing on the moon. All right. Communism. I briefly touched on it there. We do need to talk a little bit about communism. You touched on it. You should have touched on it in your global history years. But what you need to understand about communism is that communism is a form of government and a form of an economy that the government has complete control. And if it's an economic communism, they have control of the finances. They tell people what they can buy, how much it's going to cost, what to produce, what not to produce. If we're talking about it socially, they're telling people how they can, what kind of things they can dress, what they can listen to, what they can, they're going to control the state, as we say. And the United States was very anti-communist. We went through something called the McCarthy Era, where we were trying to find all the people who we thought might be communists, and we're going to put them on trial, and we're going to discover their communist truths. Because we were scared. It was called the Red Scare as well. We were scared that these communists were going to. I don't really understand what they were thought they were going to do, but we were petrified of what these communists would do if they infiltrated America. It's like the pod people, so it was an odd era in our time, and it was it led to two conflicts that we were involved in. They're not wars, they're two conflicts, one being the Vietnam conflict and the other one being Korea. And the whole point of these two conflicts was containment, was to keep those two countries from turning communist. Korea, if you've taken a few seconds to pay any attention to current events, Korea is still split on this issue. There is a North and South Korea, one being North Korea communist and South Korea being a democracy. And the idea, again, during this war was containment. So the idea was that we're going to not allow the communist Northern Koreans to infiltrate into the South. So we're going to contain them where they were. And they didn't remove the communists entirely. However, they did contain them, and they did not spread to South Korea. On the other hand, we can look at Vietnam. Vietnam had a similar situation. It was split in half. And if you look at a map today and you pay attention to world history today, the entire country of Korea, or the entire country of Vietnam, is communist. So therefore, was not a completely successful plan, because we did not contain communism out of Vietnam. It became and still is a communist country. And the war itself in Vietnam was less than popular. People American people did not support it entirely. It felt like someone else's war. It was started by the French. The French owned, was property called French Indochina. So the French owned what is now Vietnam. And the American people were like, why are we doing this? We don't need to do this. So we didn't support it very much. And what do I want to do? I want to talk about it led to people distrusting our government. And we also showed that our military, even though superior, it does not always mean that you're going to win, because we were the superior country. So that is Vietnam. That is Korea as well. I don't have to say too much more about that. I mentioned briefly the McCarthy Era. So again, efforts to keep communism out of the United States, mostly targeting individuals. The name of it, McCarthy, is named after Senator Joe McCarthy. Basically a witch hunt to find communists in the government. And they end up going into Hollywood too, when they're looking for communists in Hollywood. And Walt Disney was a giant McCarthyist, trying to weed out all the communists in the entertainment business and all that sort of stuff. I mentioned briefly the Cold War. So that's what this is all about: communism versus capitalism, the Soviet Union versus the United States. There's no physical battles, even though there's the few things we just talked about. But the United States and Russia never directly go to war against each other, so that's why it's a Cold War. Again, it's the idea of containment. We're going to stop the communists where they are, halfway through Europe, partway through Asia. They're not going to get any further. That is the basic idea of the Cold War, and that's the Iron Curtain. That's what you're going to physically stop everything with. We can talk a little bit about the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was kind of the symbolic ending of the Cold War, headed by our President Ronald Reagan, really showing support that we're going to finish the communist countries that are under the control of the Soviet Union and giving the final collapse of the Soviet Union. For those of you who are just joining us, we're doing our history review backwards tonight. We're starting towards the end and moving up. We're just looking at the Cold War right now, but we're moving backwards. We're going to look at the 1950s and after World War II. After World War II, a couple big things. There's a baby boom, and so this is because when the war ended, they were very happy, and so briefly after that, there was lots of babies being born, and we had to make room, to say the least. And a lot of people started. This was a birth of the suburbs. A lot of people started moving out of cities into suburbs, and out of rural areas into suburbs. So this is where you're getting your white picket fences, and everyone's getting a refrigerator and all sorts of things like that. We're also going to increase our highway system. We're going to have an international highway system, interstate highway system. I don't know what I'm doing. And that's going to also increase our suburban growth, because now, person A can live over here, can be kind of further away from person B, but they just jump on a highway and there they are. 10 minutes later, they're at some relative's house that they normally would have to have lived next door to. So we start to increase our highways. And that's the end of that's post World War II. If you want to add anything to the chat, you're more than welcome to. We also, at the end of World War II, have the United Nations created. The United Nations goal was to create a peace in the world, which has been relatively successful. We have not had another world war. We also, this is kind of a global hit thing, but we do go through the Nuremberg trials, where we're going to put Nazis on trial for war crimes against humanity. We're also going to do the Marshall Plan, and this is an idea that the government puts into place, and it's our goal in rebuilding Europe. So we're going to, we helped fight in World War II, and it was a mess. I mean, buildings were collapsed, and farms were now, all mined and bombed, and it disaster. And so we come up with the Marshall Plan in order to help rebuild Europe. So that's the Marshall Plan. We have a rising middle class at this time too. Okay, again, moving backwards today, moving backwards. And we're looking at President Truman. So Truman comes into play during World War II. He takes the place after Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because he dies while he's in office. He's very ill. He's a sick man through his entire pregnancy. He has polio and FDR. And Truman kind of gets slapped in the face and surprised, because he was not expecting to be president. And at the time, vice presidents were not given as much information as they are nowadays, right down to the fact that Truman didn't even know there was an atomic bomb being made, because that was such a secretive project called the Manhattan Project. So he didn't even know that the United States had access to an atomic bomb. So towards the end of World War I or World War II, he learns about the atomic bomb. He does drop an atomic bomb on Japan through his orders. He doesn't physically, he's not the one who drops it himself. He gives the orders to drop the atomic bomb. So it's a little bit about Truman, but also what we need to know is that he is going to come up with the Truman Doctrine, and the Truman Doctrine is kind of the precepts to what we're talking about with McCarthyism and the Iron Curtain and containment. And he's specifically he's going to give aid to Greece and Turkey in order to make sure that they do not turn communist. So he's going to support them so that they don't turn communist. That's the Truman Doctrine. Let's see. Truman also starts to desegregate our armed forces, so he's going to allow whites and blacks to join the same military and be in the same ranks. That also includes that can include Native Americans. Any minority was oftentimes they were sent into two separate locations in the military. So he desegregates the armed forces. Okay. Korematsu versus the United States. Korematsu is a Japanese American who was sent to an internment camp during World War II, and he said, "This is wrong. I shouldn't be sent to an internment camp." Internment camps were places where they were housing Japanese Americans who mostly were living in California, Oregon, and Washington, and they were sent to these internment camps, which were in like the desert in Utah and Arizona and New Mexico. And so they were sent to these camps, and Korematsu says, "Wait a minute, I didn't do anything wrong. This is illegal. This is against my constitutional rights to be sent to this internment camp." This goes to the Supreme Court, Korematsu versus the United States, and the Supreme Court says, actually, in a time of danger and our national safety, we do believe that Japanese Americans are a likely problem in America. So we're going to contain you all into this one location so that you can't do anything against America. That's Korematsu versus the United States. It limits our civil liberties. Okay. We got just a few more minutes here, and then we'll probably be getting off because I want to go to bed. Okay, so the United States in World War II, we get involved because of Pearl Harbor. We didn't get involved because we wanted to. We got involved because we were attacked. It was a good excuse to get involved. So the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States says, "Hey, we're in this now. Guess what? You've just awoken the sleeping giant. We're going to get involved, and we are going to kick some hiney." They don't just join up against Japan. They join up instantly against all the Axis powers, so Germany and Italy as well. And Europe and Asia had been in war for quite some time, so the United States goes right in. The things that they start with is D-Day, which is an attack on German-occupied France. So Allied forces from Great Britain and the United States mostly do an amphibious landing both in the land and sea, and attack several beaches in France to try to draw the Germans out of France. Although a lot of people died, an extremely successful day. Some key things here that you'll probably see. You might see something about appeasement, which is what the United States' plan was, and the Allies' plan was with Hitler, was that they were going to continue to just make him happy, until they realized they could that was no longer good, that this man was slightly crazy, or crazy, so they had to declare war, but there was a policy of appeasement to him for quite some time. This also, FDR is elected 4 times, or for 4 terms. He does die in his last term. He does not survive his last term, and after his 4 terms, the United States decides to make a constitutional law that a president can only be elected 2 times. FDR does do some pretty amazing things, and this is where we're going to kind of end with for this. We're going to talk a little bit about his idea of the New Deal, or what I call the alphabet soup. Because what happens is before World War II, again, we're going backwards. For those of you who are just joining us, we're going backwards today. We're starting with the past and starting with the more recent and going back into the past. And so we're in a Great Depression after World War I, and FDR says, "Hey, I got a plan. We need to get everyone back to work." He comes with up with a gazillion ideas, and they almost all have initials, like the CCC, the TVC, the SEC. I don't know. There's a FDIC, and so most of them have to do with jobs, but some of them do have to do with money, like FDIC, which you might have heard about on some commercials. So one of them, for example, is the Tennessee Valley Authority Act. I don't think there's an A. Tennessee Valley Authority, no act, just Tennessee Valley Authority. And this is the idea that there's rural places in Tennessee, still is, and they're going to create a giant dam and water system in this area to maintain safe drinking water as well as power. And so that'll supply, water, power, and we've got to create it. So that creation is going to create jobs. So he's got kind of this triple threat. And then people want to live there, and so they can build up everything in the area of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Another one that's an alphabet soup one that I really like is the CCC, which is the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was mostly for young men, and they basically went into tons of natural areas throughout the United States and were putting in charge of making campgrounds and picnic areas and hiking trails and summer camp. They went to, they went and they had 3 square meals a day, and they had a job, and they got some money. And so that, again, was threefold. So now we've got all these trails in our natural areas, but also they made some money, and they had career building, or they had personal skill building and career skill building. So it was a triple threat, or a quadruple threat, or a lot of threat. It was awesome. So these are how FDR figured, hey, this is how we'll get out of the Great Depression. And some of it was also based on finances, like the FDIC, which is how to stop banks from kind of ever closing down like they did under the Great Depression, as well as he comes up with the Social Security Act, which gives us the Social Security that we now have, so that if you lose your job, if you're at a certain age, you lose your job, you do maintain some money. Okay, that looks like what we have got for where we're going to end for now. Obviously, there's a lot more to study. If you are interested, I recommend going to regionsprep.org as a great place to study. Also, if you check out Hip Hughes History, Mr. Hughes has some amazing videos out there where he does Regents reviews, as well as he does how to write a thematic essay, how to write a DBQ. So he's great to be checking out if you are interested in learning more. So I thank you for participating tonight, and I wish you the best of luck on your exam tomorrow. Bye.